Betsy Bishop, as well as Glenn McCrae. Dan had forwarded you a link to Mr. McCrae's recent article in BT Digger, and I think we'll start off with Betsy, if you don't mind. Betsy, we have 21 folks on today, and I'm gonna hold on just one second. I like to give legislators an opportunity to say if they have any updates from their committees or things that they're working on. And right now, it looks like I'm the only legislator on, but I am sure that we will be joined by other folks. So, okay. Why don't you go ahead, Betsy, and really appreciate the time that you're taking out of your schedule today to be with the Older Vermonters Caucus, which, as you might know, is a caucus that is concerned about issues affecting older Vermonters. And we have people from all over the state here, and appreciate the time that you've taken today to be with us.
Well, thank you, Representative Wood. And I know Representative Noyes isn't on the call just yet, but thank you to both of you for the work that you've been doing in this area. You know, with the Vermont Chamber of Commerce, we are very much focused on the workforce. We have been for many, many years, but obviously due to the pandemic, there's been a crisis in so many areas, but certainly the tightening labor market is a huge issue for all of us. And I know that the Older Vermonter Caucus is focused on a lot of programs and services and things that we can do to help older Vermonters live and age well. And partly what my interest has been, and I've sort of jumped in and out of this issue over the years a little bit, is to remind folks that this is a population, I think, of 55 plus, but we can think about different levels above that. This is a population that we absolutely value and need in the workforce, and as employers, as oftentimes entrepreneurs, solo entrepreneurs. And so thinking of them as an asset and valuing that, as well as things that they need and programs that we can do to support them. So I come at this with a slightly different lens, but just knowing that it's important. I'm glad to see Glenn McCrae on the call. I've never met you before, but I think your op-ed spurred a lot of conversation, good conversation. So I'm going to stay on the call and listen, because I'm curious more about what you have to say. I'm just going to set the tone with a little bit of context about the labor force, because I know that, you know, this discussion is about how do we get more people to work to help in the communities here that we need in the aging community. But I want to set it in context of what's happening in the entire labor force. Our labor force participation rate right now is about 61%. That's down from a 10-year high of about 70%. A lot of that has occurred in the last 2 years. That's about 310,000 people working. There's about 8,200 people who are unemployed. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, unemployed means people who are unemployed and looking for work. So there are people who are unemployed who are not looking for work that aren't included in that number. And we have in Vermont right now about 25,000 jobs open, which is 15,000 jobs higher than pre-pandemic. So we have less people looking for work and more jobs open. It is of crisis proportions. The unemployed number is about in line with pre-pandemic numbers. So that 8,200, the amount of people who are unemployed, is about now, it went up and now it's back to about pre-pandemic numbers. So, you know, you have to ask yourself sort of, well, wait, what's going on then if only, you know, we've done that. So obviously, the number of people working has or wanting to work has declined. And the question for us a lot of times is, where did those people go? We just had an economic conference the last 2 days virtually. Of course, we had 400 people discussing a lot of these data and statistics. We put a DEI lens on that as well, which is a separate subject, but related that we can chat about. So I wanted to talk a little bit more specifically about the mature worker. I think you've heard about it. I've heard it mostly as the Great Resignation, sometimes the Great Quit. We hear about this nationally, and it's impacting 55-year-olds, 55 plus, who are really using this moment in time to reevaluate what they're doing. And many of them, especially in Vermont, have chosen to retire. And what retire means obviously you folks are all experts, know better than I do for sure. But it's often not going from, working at Hull speed to zero. It is often thinking about retiring and then re-entering the workforce in another manner or in perhaps a lesser way. And we absolutely need that thinking to be broadened among policy leaders, among business leaders, among hiring professionals, people who are thinking, I need one thing. I think we're at a moment in time where employers over the last 2 years have been more flexible than I've ever seen them, more willing to do things than they've ever done in the name of desperation for workers. And so I think they're starting to rethink their business models about, well, so maybe I can use a couple part-timers to do this, what used to be a full-time position. That flexibility, we often hear about that flexibility with millennials, right? We're like, oh, millennials want more flexibility. They want to work from home. They might want to work lesser schedules, or you know what? All people want that. That's not exclusive to millennials. Many people want flexibility in their work. And so I think a lot of the things that we're hearing from the younger population also are of value to the older population. And that's something that I am constantly reminding people in my constituency, which is, business people, managers, business owners, and especially hiring professionals who it's easier to sort of just do the rinse and repeat. We are way past rinse and repeat. And so I think that's good news as we're thinking about mature workers and how we get more of them into the workforce. But these people are also reviewing, okay, so I've retired from my career. I'm 60 years old, but life isn't over. No longer do those 60-year-olds decide that they're going to go be warehoused in Florida. They are vibrant. They're often still part of our world-class recreation and have a lot of value to add. So they're thinking about what's meaningful work to them in a new way, and we need to think about what is helpful as well. I think a big part of what we need to think about is sort of a cultural shift in the value and the asset that these people can bring to the workforce. And so some of that is rethinking. We as employers need to do that, workers, society, and older Vermonters themselves, frankly. I wanted to share one chart with you, and I want to show this with you. This is from the Vermont Futures Project. And it is data on, hopefully you can see that. Somebody just give me a thumbs up. Yes. Yep. Okay, great. This is data from the Vermont Futures Project, which really focuses on workforce and different economic data. It's hard to read this chart, but what you're really looking at is I'd like you to focus on the bars that are light blue and sort of a light green. And this is the age of the workforce in 2019. We are expecting new data coming out of Department of Labor and the Bureau of Labor Statistics to update this, but this gives you a pretty good idea about how many, the blue line is 55 to 64-year-olds in the workforce and 65 and over. And I think if we were to segment that down to 75 and over, et cetera, obviously that would go down. But this is 2021 is the year that the baby boomer generation begins to turn 75. So as we think about that moving through all of our demographics in Vermont, you can see that. So this is something I'm hoping, Amelia Seaman is with me today. She's with the Vermont Chamber. I'm hoping she can drop that link into the chat so you can explore that on your own more freely. But really be thinking about that. Those 45 to 54 and 55 to 64 age brackets are the largest segment of the workforce in 13 out of 14 of our counties, with Chittenden County being the exception. So deconstructing barriers for willing and able retirees to participate in the workforce not only helps to address current workforce shortages, but such action would set up Vermont's economy to be more resilient for the next couple of decades. And so that's something that we're very interested in, is the resilience of the economy. Also thinking about older workers, their participation is a good way to share their experiences and provide value to those coworkers as well as the businesses, provide leadership and experience to businesses, and then for themselves to stay socially active, community driven, which really, I think, as we've all looked at the information and studies, that's what we all need to do. So how do we get this done, I guess? I'm going to ask Amelia to I wrote an op-ed on more broadly workforce solutions, and we'll drop that in the chat. I'm only going to focus on a couple things here out of that today, but like so many issues that we have to deal with, they're complex and there's really no easy fix. We are seeing the shrinking workforce participation in the sector that serves older Vermonters, but also in construction, restaurants, office workers, manufacturers. It's everywhere. And there's no solution. There's no way to manufacture more people immediately. Like there's absolutely no way to do that. You know, even if we started like making some sort of mandate to have people have more children, it's a 22-year time frame before they enter the workforce, and we have an immediate problem. So we recognize that there's no immediate answer here, but we are advocating to keep doing what we are doing with training, certification, with second chance hiring, with making sure that the funding is there for our robust workforce development training programs, and that's what the op-ed talks more about. There are a lot of good programs, but there's just not enough people to fill them. So our two most immediate suggestions for Vermonters and for policy leaders is I would really encourage you all to get your towns to sign on to the Declaration of Inclusion. If you haven't heard about the Declaration of Inclusion, you're not alone. There's a group of retirees out of Rutland who are trying to get every town in the state to do that. Why would we have every town sign on to a Declaration of Inclusion? It's so that we can promote that we are a state that is willing to recruit people that come from diverse areas, that do not look like the majority of our 89% of our white population. And we often say that amongst ourselves, but we have no way of proving that. And the Declaration of Inclusion has now been signed on to by 28 towns. And if you want more information about that, just email me and I will connect you with the leaders there. They're presenting tomorrow to the Social Equity Caucus. We did a presentation in our economic conference about the DOI yesterday. So a lot of information there. I can email the DOI packet to Representative Noyes and Representative Wood so that they can have that as well. And we're putting up a website for this group for them to promote so that we can push more people there as well. So we will send that out to you. That's an immediate thing that we can do. We also need a sustained and robust marketing effort to encourage people to move here for jobs. And I would include the mature worker population. It's interesting when you look at the data, which I often see in the House Ways and Means Committee, is, a lot of people talk about people moving out of Vermont, and that is true, but we have people moving into Vermont. 17,000 people have moved into Vermont in the last year and a half due to the pandemic. And when you look at, we haven't been able to dissect that data too much because the data lags what actually happens. But when you look at it in the past, there's a high level of people in that 55 plus category moving to Vermont. We should be thinking about how we are encouraging them to voluntarily enter the workforce. I don't mean for volunteer work, I mean for paid work. I am working on this in the House Commerce Committee and the Senate Economic Development Committee. We will bring those suggestions to the Appropriations Committee as well. I will tell you from my experience that our appropriators do not look kindly upon marketing money being spent. But if we do not tell people outside of our borders that we want them to move here, we have jobs for them, and that we believe that mature workers are part of that, they will never know. We can continue talking amongst ourselves. There's 643,000 of us. That's a small increase from what it was, but there's only 643,000. We absolutely need more people, and we need more people in the workforce. So that are our two most immediate suggestions for you. I've got one last piece. I'm going to talk about the COVID perspective, and then I'm going to sort of wrap up and be glad to take questions or listen to Glenn or participate in any other way. The pandemic has really changed how we work and where we work, but it has also impacted how employers hire. And I think that's good news. Remote work, higher wages, greater flexibility have all been benefits over the last 2 years. While much has been made about this is what millennials want, I think we need to remember that this is also what everybody wants and mature workers want. We don't need a policy change as much as a society change. Employers, coworkers, customers embracing this thinking. And we need to be vocal about that. And we need to do it within our state and beyond our borders. Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy. It's very helpful for you to address the issue of not only, we tend to think about workforce, and we tend to think about workforce as it relates to providing services to older Vermonters. Yes. And you really helped us think about workforce and older Vermonters as being a ready, willing, and able workforce. And thinking about that from the perspective of employers, how do you have any insight in terms of how we can sort of like what you were just talking about, broaden the understanding in the employer community about the value of the mature workforce, some of whom are, here in Vermont already. So I agree with you in terms of trying to bring people into the state, but we have people who experience ageism every day when they're out there looking for work. How do we get that message to employers?
I think employers have gotten there, some better than others. I tend to think about this as an asset of being a large business. Now, speaking in a legislative realm, I know that using the term big business is not always seen as something you want to chat about, but I will tell you that there's a real benefit to having larger businesses go first. They can put resources, both financial and human resources, behind an idea. For instance, we're seeing a lot of larger businesses in Vermont hire DEI officers. That's fabulous. But most of our businesses are much smaller. If you have 20 employees, you have no ability to hire an HR director to focus on mature workers or on recruiting for diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what they can do, those larger businesses, is show us the way and show us those practices that they do, that we can, and what we do as a chamber is we draw on that and pull that down to a larger small business, a larger community that is made up of small businesses. And so I think that is certainly one way that we're working to promote that. But I also think, Representative Wood, the way you said, you often focus on how to, programs that help older Vermonters. And you need to. I mean, it is part of your role. There's a huge amount of money and programs that are good and helpful and supportive, and we have a lot of people in need. But also it is sort of that mind change about like, oh, right. I mean, how many of us are approaching an age where, in my cohort, we talk about our aging parents and how we're going to help them. And then simultaneously, we have the same conversation about, so I don't know when you're going to retire or stop working full time, but what's your retirement gig? What's your retirement side hustle? It's a whole new conversation that I've never heard about before, but I'm starting the age, right? I'm starting to. And the concept of a retirement side hustle is totally real. People want to keep working. They just might not want to be on that, next rung of the ladder, highest thing. How do I keep going higher and higher? Maybe it's like, I just want to do meaningful work. And I think that concept, as a majority of Vermont's population, gets to that age, I think society is changing with that. And I think the pandemic has forced employers to be much more flexible and fleet of foot.
Thank you. I also think one of the things that we learned from our participation in the workforce is social connections with the people that we work with. And we do know that during the pandemic and prior to the pandemic, we do have situations and people around the state experiencing isolation and loneliness, and the social connections that people experience when they're in the workforce are things that are helpful in that regard. And so we're kind of, there's multiple reasons for us to try to encourage participation of the more mature worker in the workforce. And as you said, I too have, hearing the discussions around, what's going to be your retirement gig. And people aren't, the people that I'm talking to aren't talking about, going to Florida. They're talking about, oh, well, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that.
Right.
And
I hear I can ski more, I can hike more. Does that sound like, a retired, the old-fashioned retired person? No. And so
right.
I think that is a vibrant conversation for sure.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open it up for questions before we turn to Glenn. Anybody have any questions for Betsy? Just raise your little colored hands, whatever color you have. If you do, I'll try to catch you on the screen here. Okay, Josh.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of highlight also that observation that Betsy talked about is it's, working with like multi-generational workplaces is also kind of giving all employees permission to have a healthy work-life balance. So it's one of those situations where we just felt like from a cultural perspective of where we're from, that we have to work, we have to earn those busy points, we have to work 40 hours a week, we have to make sure we do all of this, but also sharing with folks it's okay to actually have a healthy work-life balance, and you're actually better for it. You want to spend time with your grandkids, you want to spend time with your kids, and it's okay to do that. So yeah,
and I think when we think about diversity, so much is focused on race, as it should be. But when we think about having a vibrant workforce, we want that to be diversity of age, diversity of gender, diversity of race. We want people, we want veterans, we want disabled people. We have to think more broadly about that. And I think as we do, and as we all continue our curiosity in exploring more ways to be a diverse society, I think it's important that we broaden our lens too. So Joshua, I think that's really on target with that balance too. I will say, Teresa, you had mentioned that there's, in the pandemic, in the office job scenario, many people are working remotely. And that has created some loneliness for people who live alone. And I would say that happens at the, early entry to the workforce, millennial types, as well as it works for a mature worker. And so this notion of everybody wants to work from home, I get it, but there is a value in also coming to the office for, if you have a vibrant, busy life, great, but not everybody does. And I think that's something that employers are trying to figure out, that hybrid model.
There's a lot of things to balance here, it really seems. And so I appreciate that. Angela has a question or a comment for you, and then we'll move on to Glenn.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Betsy, for this really great presentation. I'm Angela Smith-Jang. I work at Dale in the Adult Services Division. Really appreciate the focus on changing the conversation around older workers and the many values and opportunities that brings to Vermont. I think it's really important that we all really try to model this too in our own workplaces, and we definitely try to do that at Dale. We have a number of staff who are much older and work part-time, but do really valuable work for the department and bring an incredible wealth of expertise and experience. Just can't say enough good things about being able to do that where we can. It takes work, though. It's really hard to shift from having, I think, a traditional FTE type position to trying to break things apart and make it work for different people who want different things. So I was curious if you had any, if the chamber or others are really working on some practical tools, strategies, things like concrete things that could be shared with partners and the business community on how to shift both our conversation and our thinking and our actual like HR practices, for example.
All is possible with more money and people. I think I would say that about probably everybody on here could repeat that, right? We are, as I speak out on these ideas, I get a lot more things to do. And so we're trying to reach out to partners who are already in that space and trying to do that. And one of those partners that we work with is SHRM. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but the Society of HR Managers. And I think that task that you just mentioned really belongs in their warehouse. And I think that's something that as that's developed, and some of that already is, we can be the promoter to businesses and be that connector. I'm not sure that the Vermont Chamber has any like special expertise on, latest HR hiring practices, but we know that SHRM does. And so instead of us doing it, we'll just rely upon them to do that. So I'm writing that down now as a task to do, because I just said it out loud to a whole bunch of people, like I need to connect with SHRM before one of you do it and say, Betsy said, but I appreciate that, Angela. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betsy, and thank you for being here this afternoon. Appreciate the time out of your schedule and appreciate the thoughts that you've shared with us this afternoon. And Glenn,
Teresa,
thank you.
Excuse me.
Thank you so much
Teresa.
for being here. Yes.
Hey, Teresa, Evan, our intern, has a question. So I was wondering if we could maybe fit that in real quick.
Sure.
Hi, Betsy. Yeah, I was just wondering if there's any like data or research on what specifically like older Vermonters who say that they'd like to work but are facing barriers. Like, what do we have any numbers as to what those barriers are for them, whether it be like transportation or so on?
That's a really good question, Evan, and I don't have that right off the top of my head, but as I mentioned, the Vermont Futures Project is a foundation that we rely on for a lot of economic data. So from this, I will reach out to Kevin Chu, who's the executive director there, and see if he has that data that he can pull in. I can get that back to Dan and Teresa and get that circulated.
Thank you. I also want to mention, as Betsy is talking about this, Angela and Dan and several of you who are on here are all part of the working group that is working on the plan to the Vermont Plan to Age Well, and certainly employment is one of those areas in the Older Vermonters Act that we asked to be addressed in that plan. So all of the information that Betsy is sharing here and the contacts and stuff, those will be things that are researched and investigated and included in that plan. I see Angela shaking her head up and down, so that's good. Okay, and sorry I didn't see your hand, Evan. Glenn, I think we really are ready for you now.
Okay, thanks. Evan's question was a great one and something that we're really interested as well. And so I'm Glenn McCrae. My current work relevant here is as co-chair of the Burlington Aging Council, and I've posted a link to that. And although I'm here as an individual, not representing the Aging Council, and I really appreciate Betsy's enthusiasm and positive attitude about we're gonna do this. that's great. And I think we need a lot more of that, as opposed to a kind of deficit mentality of how, things aren't bad, but we have the tools, I think, to move through. I also want to recognize, and I know there are a couple of other members of the Burlington Aging Council on the call today as well. But I just wanted to take a minute and kind of introduce the council and its work as another resource as we get moving ahead in Vermont's largest city to do this really important work. This is a council that was set up by the administration and city council last summer. We got going just in the fall. It's a really good group of diverse stakeholders and agencies serving older residents of Burlington specific, though we are starting all of our work acknowledging the fact that we are just part of the greater whole. And as much as possible, we're certainly aligning what we're thinking about on the council with the evolution of the state plan and the state work in these areas, not trying to go separate certainly from that, and we'll be taking a lot of that in as many of our members are serving on that committee as well. So we were really created to formally start to elevate the issues and voices of older residents in the city of Burlington as the city itself grows and changes, to make sure that those voices are heard, concerns are being addressed as we move things forward. In other lives, back in 2005, I worked with AARP to author the first livable cities study of Burlington. And one of the really interesting outcomes of that was a finding that of all the things that older residents said they valued about the city, they were things that matched directly what younger families were saying. So as we create and work with these different populations, I think making things better for older Vermonters, whether it's in living conditions or work conditions, are things that are going to affect more broadly. And that's something Betsy has raised. And I think something for us to really keep in mind. We're not doing a special cutout here for older folks. We're really redesigning the workforce and working conditions, making it better for all. So we have a pretty large charge in the city, looking at everything from health and food security, social inclusion, transportation options, accessible indoor and outdoor spaces, housing affordability, technology accessibility, family caregiver support. So we have a wide-reaching charge to think about things for the city. Our action is more to inform and address possible policy and program work, and bring that back to City Council and the mayor's office to hopefully advance. And over that, as Betsy mentioned in the work that her groups are doing, we have an overall DEI lens that we look at for all of this as well. I just read a really interesting chapter in a book that Pablo Bose, who many of you probably know from the University of Vermont, wrote on looking at resettlement of immigrants, specifically in Vermont. And he has the final chapter on aging and immigration, aging and refugee populations, and the idea. And he deals with both ends of that aging idea of aging youth as well as aging elders, and the special needs that we really need to take into account of those populations who have either been here for a while or are coming new, with I think it's 135 new members of our community from Afghanistan being settled in. What are the more special needs that those folks will bring? So we have this large charge. I have a very special interest in workforce. I've run a national project at the University of Vermont on workforce for the transportation sector for the last decade. I worked for 20 years working to support the nonprofit sector's workforce needs in the state with the Vermont Community Foundation. And now, having passed that magic threshold of turning 65, I have a special interest in these types of issues going forward. And especially getting tired of a decade of reading Art Wolf columns on what a deficit older folks are to the state and the state budgets. And so my mission is really to try to raise the idea of we have this incredible asset ahead of us. And I think, I really appreciate Betsy's emphasis on that. There are 60, by my count and looking at the data, and it's not as accurate as Betsy's numbers, but about 65,000 Vermonters within that 60 to 74-year-old age bracket. That's a massive potential part of workforce. But we don't know really that much about them. Who are they really? What are their, the question that Ethan had, what are their needs? What are the barriers? And how do we find out? So this has led me to just really a lot of questions as opposed to I don't have a lot of answers on this. I hope to get at that with the work we're doing on the council, certainly as it affects Burlington, but that's going to tie very much into the work that Betsy has talked about that's going on statewide. So I'm really interested in what programs, policies, and investments are going to be made to determine what role this population has in addressing that workforce deficit that we really have. It's not going to solve it all, but there are a significant group that can do that. And as Betsy mentioned with the Great Resignation, this idea, well, what has been done to look at the interests and needs of those workers 55, 60 plus who are leaving the workforce? And what can we do to both retain them? It's always easier to retain somebody in a position than it is to recruit them to something new. So another whole area, and this should be of real concern for the legislatures, what do we know about the impact that increased or partial or full employment would have on the economic, social, and mental health of this population? That would potentially defer expenditures on the state level in those areas. So we know that engagement is really important in all of those areas. Employment can be a major way of deferring a lot of the costs we see in state budget areas, but we don't know what that really is. I always wonder why older Vermonters are have been invisible in the discussion of how we address the workforce crisis. And I've been trying to watch as much as possible the testimony that's been given in the discussions in the different committees and the bills that are being formulated. And I just see a dearth of this population group in the discussion, in the mix. And I still see that magic cutoff age of 64. Oh, the working population is declining, and the working population, as we know, is 18 to 64. Well, it isn't, and I think we ought to be calling that out on a regular basis. And in every bill that's being formulated, I mean, my call out would be, why not just call out older Vermonters as something to be dealt with? We don't have to have the answers. But if we don't start listing that as a group that we want to target and help develop, we're going to continue to really forget about them as we start formulating programs, making expenditures. We've got to raise that visibility. So I think there's a lot of heavy lifting in really moving from looking at older workers and older residents of our state as a real asset and not as a growing liability. And I think there's three areas that I would really emphasize, and I'm going to be working in as I take my work forward with the council and with other efforts. And the first is just that. Let's get that reference to older workers in all of those bills. As we take up things like adult education programs and how we're going to I think there's a lot of exciting work going on in that area. Well, let's not drop off adults at 64. Let's talk about how we build education programs that are truly lifelong learning and say, what do we need for those workers 60, 64 that want to start their own businesses, that want to retool their skills to do something different because they don't want to be the head of a corporation or a division or a department at the end at 64. I certainly don't want to supervise anybody now. I'm done with that. But there's a lot of other work that I can do. I know Betsy is going to go in that direction. And we don't have to have career tracks that just do this and suddenly fall off the edge. We really can re-engage after we've made great contributions out there in the state. And we need to see, how do we help people do that? We also need to look at our small business development programs and how, as they kind of go out and educate Vermonters to start up businesses and, make their services available, that we're recruiting all along the age spectrum as well. And that's a pretty simple thing to be able to do in the mandate for those programs. I think there's a lot we need to do for, and Betsy started to mention this with the HR professionals, but we really need to re-engineer the workplace, re-engineer our HR policies to bring in and both retain again and bring in new workers. And how do we help employers? How do we help the state as one of the major employers to think about this? And that's a heavy lift with the State Workers Union, but I think it's a conversation that certainly has to happen. How do we engage partnerships with the private sector and the nonprofit community to look at what are those types of retooling and incentives that need to happen? How do we rewrite job descriptions and job standards to attract older workers? How do we reimagine what part-time flexible work schedules are? How do we think about, the state policies that may influence how we do it, like unemployment insurance and so forth? There's a lot in that actual mix, but we need to be able to thinking about all those things. And it's a partnership across all of the sectors to do that. And then finally, in terms of, a marketing campaign, I agree. Anything we do to recruit the outside worker to come to Vermont has got to include the mature worker. So in recent articles, we've seen, a list of kind of people, the climate refugee article from, I believe, 7 days on folks coming to Vermont. They looked at it across the spectrum, age spectrum of folks that are coming here and not necessarily coming here to retire just because they're 60 or 65. They're coming here to be engaged. And how do we do that? So how do we create a concerted campaign that creates a vision for those 60-plus-year-olds to reimagine, for them to personally reimagine the next chapter of their career path that really balances personal well-being with the contribution they want to make to the state, because many of them have 5 to 20 years of productivity, potentially in the workforce that they might be able to offer. And I challenge you to ask a 25-year-old if they want to stick with a job or even with Vermont for 5 to 20 years, if they can see that. The other great thing about recruiting the older Vermonter is they're already here. They are already housed. They have 40 years plus experience working. So they're the ideal candidates that, we don't have to solve the housing crisis necessarily in Vermont for them to be here. So I think there's a lot of reasons that taking this up as a significant challenge in the legislature, as well as throughout the other sectors, is really something that is going to benefit all of us. So I will get off my speaker's box here, and certainly glad to engage in more conversation around this. I'm really excited about the work that the Vermont Futures project is doing. I think there are a lot of assets out there that we can turn to keep this moving ahead. So thanks, appreciate the time. And I appreciate the work. This is last week's conversation is a really nice benchmark or bookend to this week's conversation.
Great, thank you, Glenn. That was great. Does anyone have any questions for Glenn?
I don't
Anybody?
have any questions, Representative Noyes, but
Yeah.
I want to thank both Glenn and Betsy for these wonderful presentations today. It's very thought-provoking. And I also want to echo something that Angela said and Glenn just hit on, which is, at the area agencies on aging, obviously a large percentage of the people that we are serving are older, or their families or caregivers. And we have also hired staff that are older, and people that they thought they wanted to retire, but they really didn't necessarily want to retire. And they've been really wonderful additions to our staff. And they've also been incredible connectors with, both just thinking about their perspective in terms of programming. So, and also extremely relatable to people that call. So they're huge assets. And I love this discussion. It's fantastic. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And also just to, I think we did get the attention of our Commerce Committee because their intern has joined us today and is taking notes and will be reporting back to them. So I see Catherine here. I got an email from one of the members of that committee. So we have their attention, so fantastic. Hi, thanks Catherine for joining us. I don't know if anyone else has any questions or comments they want to bring up.
I'd love to add one thing. First of all, I think Glenn and I just need to go out for long coffee because like he's sparking all these ideas in me. But just a couple of things to play off what you talked about, Glenn, is there's this thing that I'm sure you've all heard about. It's called the gig economy, right? Like, and oftentimes it's thought of in a bad way. Like, you got to have 2 or 3 or 4 gigs to make it. The gig economy is made for the mature worker, like, duh, right? Like, again, back to that notion of what do I want? I don't want that full-time job. I think Glenn said, I don't want to manage people. Yeah, there's a lot of things that maybe you don't want to do in retirement, but there's like all sorts of like consulting gigs or part-time jobs or seasonal jobs in Vermont. And part of the cultural shift that we have is we have this sort of general notion in Vermont, big business is bad. Business on the wholesale offers, we don't want to talk about them unless they're offering whatever good jobs are. And there's this definition among the policy leaders, that thought leaders that are like defining what that good job is. And I really encourage us to think about good jobs being different. It's hard for us to determine what a good job is for somebody else. And so, if you think about that person who's 65, who is retired from a great career in something or other, maybe they do want to work at a gig that's 2 days a week, and they really don't care if that's minimum wage or not. That is a good job to them for their reasons. And in Vermont, I think about a lot of employers that have part-time work and have seasonal work. And there's, Vermont Teddy Bear needs to hire 800 people between November and February every year. That's it. Like, that's when their business is. We can castigize them for, not having that year round, but that's when their business is. This is a perfect thing for a mature worker who's like, you know what, maybe I'll work around the holidays, get a little extra cash and be fine. This works. So there's lots of things like that. And we need to realize that we need to offer all sorts of different opportunities and let them worry about, if there's a benefits cliff with a mature worker about how much I can work, the seasonal and part-time work is perfect.
Great, this is a great topic, and I think we'll probably circle back to this at some point. I had a great conversation earlier in the week with Sarah Buxton, and she couldn't make it today, but I would like to see if she would like to join us for a short part of one of our caucuses, just to talk about some of the ideas she had. She works for Department of Labor. So I think that there's definitely a great interest in this topic, and I'm sure we'll be back visiting it soon. I also want to note that Angela put some of the write-up from one of the principles from the Older Vermonters Act in the chat, and I think it's definitely a good thing to note that we're really thinking about these issues and both in some of the past work and moving forward. So thanks for doing that. Any other questions?
Just had one,
Dan?
Dan. It's Mary Hayden.
Oh, hey, Mary.
Hi, sorry. Thank you, Representative Noyes and Representative Wood, for not only this presentation today, but I think this caucus is just growing and getting more robust every week. So thank you. But I did want to add that from the perspective of the area agencies on aging, that this is a very high priority for us. So I'm absolutely thrilled to hear from Glenn and Betsy today on this topic. And so much so that we've decided that our fall conference will focus on mature workers. So I hope that we can connect with a number of you. Certainly have a lot of ideas just listening to all of you, and want to thank you for bringing this very important issue to the forefront.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Next week will be members from our congressional delegation. I think I see one of them here, who's been joining us weekly, Beth Stern. I don't know if she's still here. Oh yeah, she is. But we'll have others next week. So yeah, think of your questions and comments for our congressional delegation, maybe even around this particular topic. So it's good. Yeah, so that should work. Thank you. Anything else anyone wants to add before we break here? Teresa?
I think we're all set. I think one of the things that I was just going to say a minute ago was on the workforce issue. It's always helpful to hear from people impacted directly. And maybe when we have Sarah back, we could hear from some mature workers who have been successful, and those who, a couple maybe who have not been successful in entering or re-entering the workforce, to get their perspectives. And it makes me think about sometimes people need encouragement to put themselves out there, and thinking about maybe not thinking that our employers are as willing as they are becoming to looking at a more mature workforce. So hearing from folks directly impacted, I think we'll make note of that for a future topic, maybe when Sarah is here. That would be great. So thank you, everybody, for being here today.
Great.
And I think we'll wrap up, right, Dan?
Yeah, I just, Ruby, you posted something in the chat invite. I'm not quite sure. If you want to talk more about that, I don't know what it is.
A4TD, you should know what A4TD is. Everyone should. A4TD is Associates for Training and Development, and they specifically work with older adults who are interested in re-entering the workforce from age 50 and up, and they help them with learning new computer skills and developing their interview skills and building a resume. And then they set them up with internships within the community. So we have interns that go through A4TD, and they practice on the job skills in our office, and they get paid to do that work. And then while they're doing that, they're also interviewing and looking for jobs elsewhere in the community. And the whole point is to help older adults build the skills to re-enter the workforce. And I think I was surprised that they weren't part of this conversation, but it sounds like, Wendy, they are Vermont Associates. It sounds like maybe not enough people know who they are. So, you know, if you want help connecting with them, they're right across the hall from Cove, actually, and happy to help with that connection.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. And I'm sure this conversation will continue.